Kweskina, my name is Alexandre Nequado. I'm here with my colleague André Dudemaine. This week we have our guest Terry Jones. Terry, if you could introduce yourself, please.
Bonjour, hello. My name is Terry Jones. I'm from the Seneca Nation of Indians. We're located about 30 and 60 miles. We're on two territories, 30 and 60 miles south of Niagara Falls. I'm a filmmaker. I've done narrative, documentary, but I'm mostly kind of known for my experimental work. I'm currently studying film production for my MFA at York University, going into my second year. And presently I'm finishing up my thesis film, and I'll start my research on for my MFA on intergenerational historical trauma in Indigenous media.
Hi Terry, welcome again in Montreal, because you were there. You were there with your last film, Savage Future, during the last festival, well, about 1 month ago. So it's good to see you again, to speak to you again. I see you have been involved in films since several years. Looking at on internet, I saw that even you participated in 2011 at the selection of the festival at the New York City on Bowling Green, the fantastic National American Indian Museum, when Elizabeth Weatherford, a good friend of us, was doing this fantastic festival in New York City. Was it one of your first experience as involvement in film, native film?
Yeah, sort of. I mean, in 2011, I had known some of the people in the film department, including Elizabeth Weatherford, and they were asking some people to be selectors. So when I found out who was the other selectors, they were like academic scholars. And I hadn't gotten to film school yet. I wouldn't go to film school until 2012. And I'm like, why did you choose me? And they like, you seem like you have a real like passion for film. And they kind of wanted like an everyday man sort of point of view on the selection committee. But prior to that, it was really what had started me on interested in film was some summer workshops that they had here on my territory in the summer when I was in high school. And they introduced us into photojournalism, and then the following year it was video. But when I look back at it, I'm like, there really were no mentors or indigenous people, notable indigenous people who were making films. So I kind of felt like that wasn't for me. And then I graduated high school a year early, moved to New York City. I went for a business degree, but I didn't finish. But that passion for film was always there. And then one of my last jobs I had was working on Wall Street, actually near the World Trade Center, and I lost my job on 9/11. And then my therapist that I saw at the time, she said, when people go through a traumatic event, they either go through two things. They either go into depression or they can go into something called post-traumatic growth. So it was shortly after I had lost my job, I picked up my friend's camera and I made my first short called What in the Heck is Corn Soup? Where I show the process of boiling wood ash, corn, Iroquois white corn, and salt pork and kidney beans. And that was my first film. But it wasn't until 2012 when I applied at Syracuse University and got accepted into the film program there.
It's interesting. You say that the point of view of an everyday man, and somehow, I may be wrong, you will tell me, but somehow it seems that in your film you want to have the way of an everyday man that is presented through your work. I am right.
Yeah, it was funny. Syracuse University has a really great scholarship for Haudenosaunee students. If you get accepted in, you get a full scholarship. And so that was the main reason why I applied, was to get in the film program. But then when I got there, or before I got there, I did some research on the film program, and it wasn't like a fast track to Hollywood. It was actually independent filmmaking, more or less. So when I got there, it was more or less doing the non-traditional. I don't want to say non-traditional. As I said, it wasn't a fast track to Hollywood, but it was really I felt like it was the what do you call it? The mechanics of filmmaking, the craft of filmmaking. So we started out briefly. It was like, what's your story, and then how do you want to tell it? And so a lot of it was learning by doing. And so for me, and Elizabeth Weatherford has a big joke about that, because I always somehow managed to put Iroquois white corn in my film. And so it's either sitting in the background, or it's just right out in the open. And same with Savage Future. Even though you don't see it, it's the sound of it is in the back, is creating the soundscape. But for me, it's being able to portray contemporary Indigenous or Seneca Haudenosaunee life and culture, through film and video. It's not that I don't want it to be nice and glossy and like Hollywood looking. I kind of like the idea that it's more authentic, that it's not perfect, I guess, in the way that we see films. Presently, right now, I'm shooting my thesis film, but I think that's going to be an elevated up compared to in terms of quality, in terms of like using a cinematographer and using lights and I'm interested to see how I put it all together. I'm like 90% of the way done with it. So
good. Already, I know that probably many people that are listening to us are wondering, who is that guy? And I think we have to go really to your. There is a site, tornjerseymedia.com, where we can find all your films, even the one you did when you were a student, and that's interesting. Is it your own website, or I was wondering, I discovered it just today. Yeah.
Oh wow, yeah. It's my own website. People are like, "What does Torn Jersey mean?" And it's actually an anagram of Terry Jones. There was a member of the English comedy group, Monty Python. So when they would play on our PBS station, public television station, I would see my name scroll in the credits. So I used to watch it, and then one evening it wasn't there, and there was Torn Jersey. So I wrote it down. I'm like, it's an anagram of my name. So no, Torn Jersey is kind of like my production company. Everything that I release has Torn Jersey Media on it. I maintain the website. It needs to be updated, but it's almost like and lately, I think last year, I had made most of my film works publicly accessible. The only ones that aren't on there are the ones that are through my distributor. 6 of my short films, the ones that have made the biggest impact, are distributed through the Canadian Filmmakers Distribution Center in Toronto. And the big thing about that, aside from kind of like the film festival windows have already passed, but it does have institutional and academic value. So I think Concordia and I think Carleton University are purchasing my film works as learning tools that they're doing in Indigenous cinema in their courses. Oops, André, I don't hear you.
So also we have to go to Canadian Filmmakers Distribution Center to see some of your work too.
Yes.
Okay. Yes, I see it now. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. And but anyway, if we stick to Torn Jersey, we have important film like Soup for My Brother.
Mm-hmm.
And as you mentioned before, this is one of my questions too. there is always food in your films. Even the one you did with probably other students called Scarlet, which is Edgar Allan Poe's inspired, I suppose, story. And there is a salad that is going on beside the corpse of a lady. And already there, the food was present in the film. Is it something that you want to keep in all your works? This relation to the what we eat.
Yeah. It's funny that my there is Torn Jersey Media, but my moniker is actually Corn Soup. So sometimes, so usually when I do film presentations or film screenings, like small ones in libraries, I'll usually screen soup for my brother last because it shows my dad making roast corn soup, and then in the end I will present the soup to the audience, and it sort of like creates this sort of idea for me about having activating all five senses, and it doesn't end up being me on the stage and the audience or the viewers in the audience. It ends up being more a communal thing. So it kind of creates this idea of authentic dialogue. But with Scarlet, it was funny because I studied that in the FAMU Film School in the Czech Republic. And most of my films, almost all of my films, has either Indigenous or Haudenosaunee themes. And when we were putting Scarlet together, it was done on 35 millimeter film. So we actually learned the craft of like making films like the old Hollywood style. So, you know, it's a big giant camera and it's very loud. It's like, and so you have to do the action and then you have to do a cut. Now we're going to do one for sound, and you record the sound. But when we were thinking, when I was doing my input, I'm like, well, what isn't in our language? I think, no, not in our language, in our culture, I think a lot of cultures have, they feed the dead. And that's where I said, well, why don't we, but it looked beautiful. We found this Swiss chard, we found beets, and like, it looked really rich on the, on the screen. So we said, well, why don't we see if he can bring her back to life by feeding her first. But yeah, food has some, as I said, it mostly has to do with corn. Even in my thesis film, my dad plays the grandfather, and he's actually putting corn into jars. He's harvesting corn in the jars, and there's the sound of corn. But yeah, it's part, but it is a part of every culture, I think, and that might be the universal thread that people can identify with is food, traditional food, no matter what culture you're from. But hopefully I can do it in a way that it's interesting or it's adding to the story as well, and it's just not there for just because.
Well, I will remember that next time you come to Montreal First Peoples Festival. You will do soup, and we will serve it to living people.
Yes, totally. I would be loved that.
Yeah. Also, this link with the tradition that is always present in your film with the culture goes often with the relation with the family, with the elder, with the father, with the uncle. And in your film, it doesn't seem that easy, that transmission. There is always some kind of difficulty to keep on with the tradition and with the identity. Can you speak about it a little?
The one thing that I know that people that my film gets described, it's like on the surface, it can come across as feeling really simple. Oh, it's a story about a father and son, and they're starving, and the son and the father is to go out and kill a deer. But everything for me, everything is layered. There's a lot. There's no incidental events that happen in my film. So any action, any prop, any costume that there has a purpose. It's there for a reason. And my film work has been described sometimes as a simple story, but well told. Even now in doing my MFA, I wrote a couple of short screenplays, and my cohorts as well said, and they weren't putting me down for it. They just said it's a very simple film, but it's well told. And I did one screenplay that was 4.5 minutes. It was 4.5 pages, but it was so encapsulated in telling the story that that they had nothing to say about it. It's almost like since I graduated from Syracuse, it wasn't until then that I realized that most of my films on my website are class assignments. There were things that I did over a weekend. I might have polished them up and increased the production value, later. But for the most part, they're just learning tools. And after I graduated in 2016, I found this. I learned how film festivals work. And one, you can't send out all your films at once. So I kind of like had to layer them up. So Soup for My Brother was like a tissue box. So Soup for My Brother was first. So, and that takes a 1-year film festival cycle. And then it was probably Empire State. And then I think Give and Take was first. But what I've learned is that there is a want for my aesthetic, my way of storytelling, how I'm doing it, the pace of it. So since graduating, I've kind of grown into this idea that it's passed me, that it's gone with me to York University, that I own like my way of storytelling. I'm not sure if I answered your question, but that's sort of like how my academic journey in terms of, and then understanding what I really appreciate with First Peoples Festival is I'd like to think that, as I said, they might be simple stories well told, but they're deeper than that. And the comments that we get from Q&A and people who come up afterwards and people who comment, it resonates with them in ways that, and not just Indigenous people, but the dominant culture, everybody in the outside world.
Yes. I can say as a festival director that it's really, really good stuff, good movie, and obviously everybody can appreciate and relate the content. But let's go into the stories in the movie. If I look at Unearthed, for example, or Grit, there is always kind of difficulty, I won't say conflict, but difficulty between the elder and the actual Seneca or Haudenosaunee man. And if I look at your last film, I saw Savage Future. What do we do with all those memories and with all those recordings and photos? What are their meaning today? And this always seems to be the gap. One of the subjects of the film is the gap between the nowadays life and all this heritage that is behind and that is not that easy to grab.
Yeah, actually that kind of parlays into my thesis film. It's about it was inspired by Soup for My Brother. So in Soup for My Brother, my father recounts a story that him and his brother stole his grandfather's butcher knife. And so they stabbed that knife into a tree. And then 57 years later, my dad goes back to that same tree and you can just see a little bit of the handle sticking out of the tree. So I said, that would be such a great story to tell, make it a narrative, using that knife to narrative effect. So I wrote this screenplay, and I'm most likely, like I said, I'm 80% of the way done filming. But it's about a 15-year-old Seneca boy who steals his grandfather's butcher knife. Takes place in the 1950s, but the grandson is in love. Is enamored with World War II. And, we kind of visit him in his own little world, and he's hiding and he's reading about army life. And then we kind of transition to the grandfather, and he's harvesting, he's taking corn off the cob, he's hanging up Indian, we call it Indian tobacco, but tobacco, indigenous tobacco. But the conflict comes in is when the grandfather is trying to teach the grandson custom and tradition. But because of the boy's age, but then two, because the boy doesn't understand what's at stake, the grandfather already knows like what's happened in colonization. They can already see, even in the 50s, our loss of language, our loss of culture, our loss of way of life, and the dominant culture. And I'm guilty of that as well. I love my iPhone. I love all my technological gadgets. But you got to find that balance between maintaining your indigenous identity without getting totally absorbed in the outside. And so the grandfather and grandson have this conflict where the boys' dog tags, military dog tags, play ones, fall on the table, and the grandfather says, these ideas, they belong out there. And his he said, these are playthings. So then when the grandfather leaves, the grandson picks up his grandfather's butcher knife and says, these things are time wasters. These things are playthings. So he goes into the woods, he breaks the knife, he's going to stab it into the tree. But the idea is that, so then when he comes back, the grandfather says, where is it? And he just says, who's going to remember you? Who's going to remember? So he goes and retreats into the farm, the grandfather, and then the grandson comes along and he knocks on the door, and the grandfather says, more. And I heard this from an elder. They said, there'll be a day, we were told there'll be a day when the young folk would rise above us. And he goes, and who's going to remember you? And the boy's like looking at him through the slat of the door, and the grandfather says, I don't think so. So the boy's devastated. He let his grandfather down. So then he grabs his, originally he was supposed to get some Indian medicine in the woods. So he looks down at his satchel and says he wants to do the right thing. So he grabs that satchel, he puts it around his shoulder, he bolts for the woods, and he says, I'll remember, grandfather. And then we flash back to today, and we see the older boy who's now sitting under the tree, and he says, I remembered, grandfather. And that's the gist of my thesis film. But you know, like I said, it could be on the surface, it's just a boy who steals his grandfather's butcher knife. But there's a whole, I'd like to think, I can't wait to put it together to see it, but it's layered. There's a lot of layers in it. There's just the grandfather interacting with corn, interacting with Indian tobacco, you know, with tobacco. And if I think at first the grandfather might come across as being stern, but I think our audience and viewers kind of already know what's happened already, that we are getting absorbed. We are losing our language. We are in many ways losing our culture, but there is a renaissance, a resurgence of it. So it's not all, you know, doom and gloom. There are new language immersion programs. There are younger folk who are learning our ways, but I hope it comes out as well as I'm describing it. So I haven't really reviewed the footage, but based on my track record, you know, and based on how I'm just going with my instinct of how I think the story should be told, I think it should be good. I hope.
Also, what I am writing a text about the last big filmmaker Jeff Barnaby, and well, I see a lot of similarity, not in the films, obviously, the production, but on the journey to the community, to the filmmaking. And first of all, no role model, right? And nowadays, yes, there is established indigenous filmmakers, but it's really recent. And I suppose when you were a child, there was no direct connection, obvious connection between your expectation in life and film as an art or as an industry. And second, you really are connected with your where you come from. When you go to film industry, it's not too disconnect or to go to another reality. It's a way to explore your own origin. So I see a lot of similarity. And I was wondering, how come you, at the point you decide I will be a filmmaker when you have no model in front of you where you can say, oh, I want to be Alanis Soponsawinud, I want to be Chris Eyre, or I want to be Zacharias Kunuk.
Yeah, there's what I think it comes down to, for me, a lot of it has to do with opportunities. And for many Indigenous people, you know, when I do presentations, especially to the young people, you know, I'm like, many times in our lives as Indigenous people, we're told we're less than. And so when I went back to school in 2012 at Syracuse, and I ended up graduating first in my class out of 600 students, but it wasn't like, but we'll take a step back. Both of my parents went to residential school. My mom actually was a resident there. My dad was a day student. But there was something that they instilled in me, and that's sort of like, it's there, but it's not there in Savage Future. But it's like, there is a mistrust in the dominant culture for authority figures. And that includes police, or justice, that includes health or doctors, and it also includes teachers. So there was sort of like this idea of academia. I wanted to be in academia, but then as my business degree didn't work out, I'm like, well, that's not for me. But it wasn't until these opportunities came out at Syracuse to offer these scholarships. And I'm like, do I go back and finish my business degree, or do I try film? And that's what I think it comes down to is, especially with even with York University as well, regardless of what part of the border you're in, you're considered a domestic student. And it's not just important for the one who's applying, but it's important for our family. It's important for our friends that they know there's opportunities that historically and maybe even systematically were not there, and now they're present. So now, like my nephew who's playing in my thesis film, which is nice. I'm using my family. My dad's playing the grandfather. My nephew is playing the grandson, and then my brother is playing the present day son. But he's been in 3 films of mine so far. My nephew, my dad's 3 or 4. But especially with my nephew, he sort of realizes that there is no lack in terms of like having access to, if you want to be a filmmaker or you want to be an artist. And presently right now, in this term, I'm doing a TA-ship, and it's a big class. It's called Making Media, and there's 300 students, and there's six TAs doing 50 students. So I have 25 students in each session, but it's not Indigenous specific. It's general. So I feel really good that I'd like to influence or offer advice to the Indigenous young minds, but I'd like to think that these non-Indigenous students will have I will offer them a different perspective on how we view media, because everything seems like, we're all part of this global culture. We're all part of it. I'm part of it. But then when we look at, say, a short film from the country of Georgia, it's sort of like, I can give them my perspective of looking at it as through an Indigenous lens. And one of my biggest things that I say and I think it's on my Twitter or Instagram, I'm humanizing the other through film and media, because I think a lot of times this idea of hatred or mistrust in people who are labeled other is because they're easier to put in groups. But if you do a film and the character's relatable, and it's not they happen to be Indigenous, I have an opportunity to either dispel stereotypes of who we are. We all have this idea of what, not just Indigenous people, I think, but especially it's coming up with the young people. It's all about taking care of the environment. It's taking care of the children, taking care of the elders, planning for that 7th generation in the future. It's not just all about accumulation and what can I get. because we know when we come into this earth, we come in with nothing, and when we go, we don't take our accumulation with us. So I'd like to think that there's and I see it in the younger people. They get that idea that the environment is kind of, it's in chaos. We need to do something. So
yes, I think this is a reality we cannot dodge right now, because it's so dramatic and tragic what happens to Mother Earth, and the change we have to do, and the politicians and the society doesn't seem to be in gear to take the right direction in time. It's really terrible, of course. Also, the question that probably you know I will arrive to is, after all those short films, are you looking for a long feature film in the near future?
Yeah, in 2000, excuse me, in 2005, this was part of my after I lost my job at 9/11. I made my own 2 short films. What in the Heck is Corn Soup, and they're on my website, and also Thomas Indian School Reunion, which I filmed in 2004, which is a group of former students who went to the Thomas Indian School on my territory, which was open from 1856 to 1957. It was here for 100 years. But former students come and they share their stories, and it's not all doom and gloom. There's really inspirational testimonials there on how they overcame this institution ideal of kind of like try to make them forget who they are. And that was in Savage Future. Kill the man in him and kill the Indian in him and save the man. You have to remind me, what was the question? I went off on this little tangent, but it does lead into.
Well, what will be your first feature film?
Oh, right. Okay. Yeah.
And
yeah. So that was in 2004. 2005, I took part at the Institute of American Indian Arts in Santa Fe. They brought 20 emerging indigenous filmmakers together from all over the states. And for 6 weeks during the summer, we made short films. And out of that, my work there, I got a 1-year talent development program with ABC Disney. And so part of the program was writing a feature-length screenplay. And up to that point in time, I had never written anything. And so there was a big learning curve for me. In terms of storytelling. They're like, so what's your story? And I'm like, oh, it's about a 13-year-old Seneca girl who gets sent to a residential school in the 1940s, but she's stuck between the 2 worlds of her modern mother of the 1940s and her traditional grandmother. And then when she goes to the residential school, she's stuck between 2 worlds, because she's got the girls who have been there their whole lives. That's all they know are institutional rules. And then you kind of got the rebel girls, the traditional girls who come in. So there's kind of like that conflict, and she goes between the two worlds. So that was a 1-year program. I wrote it. It's done. It's a feature-length screenplay. They had a 1-year option on it. It expired, so now it's mine. So I kind of have that in my back pocket. The one thing I did know and learn was that, period films do not make money. This play takes place in the 1940s. And then how are you going to recreate these residential schools? And then you got costumes. I mean, that's a pretty big budget. But I have that in my back pocket in terms of, like, if anybody goes, hey, I like your short films. Do you got somebody with money? Maybe when I say, what do you have in long form? But when I originally finished that screenplay, I lived in New York City, and a friend of mine was part of the Times Square playwrights, and so they said, we'll do a reading of your 15 characters you have in your film. So we did a table read, and I said, hey, the pizza's here, it's time to have lunch. They're like, no, we want to know what's going to happen. So I'd like to think, sometimes ideas take time to be actualized, and it's not instantaneous. a film idea I might have now, like my thesis film, I wrote that screenplay 4 years ago, and it's taken this long for it to be actualized. Savage Future, I did in school 11 years ago, and it wasn't until last year I'm like, let me look at the images and see if I can get access to them or if I have permission to use them. A lot of the iconic ones were public domain. Of course, I have access to my own personal ones. So, but hopefully somewhere along the line, I can make a feature. And I don't know what format, because I like narrative, I like documentary, and I also like experimental is like the time to play for me to. Just to give a little context to Savage Future, I took Iroquois whitecord and I put it in a container, and then I was listening to the smoke dance, and then I shook and tapped to the music, or what I heard in my headphones, and then I took that soundscape and I put it onto the video editor, Final Cut Pro, and I slowed it way down, and then every time you hear this beat, and it's a weird sound the corn makes, it's like. So every time that beat hits, I change the image. So I don't really have control. I have control over what's shown, but I don't have control over when the edit occurs. And what I find is that sort of how I put that together, the sound makes the viewer question what they're hearing, but then because it's over and over, then it's sort of like it creates a sense of expectation, in some ways, tension. And I did another one that you guys screened called Geek Squad, How I Lost My Indian Name, and that I did with my eye blinks. Every time I blinked, the image would change above my head. So experimental is the way that I really like. I love to experiment with the form. And even Suit for My Brother is a documentary, but it's called a poetic documentary. I mean, everything about it is true. The story's true. What my dad does is true. But in terms of like how I arranged it, it's I don't know. It gets described as poetic.
And what you said about the corn and the sound, it can also remember, I don't know how you call it in English, this traditional instrument, where so it, in a sense, it could be a reference to the music we can hear in the longhouse during the ceremonies.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think I know I'm not the only one doing it. There's others that we're playing with the form, but we're using our own things that are in our own world. That, as I said, the sound of corn. It could be the sound of a turtle rattle. Like manipulating that, and it could be a water drum. And have I done that? I've used it in this give and take. This it's on my website, Narrative Short, where a linguistic, a white man who's a linguistic anthropologist comes to the reservation to record songs for his research, but he gets lured into the woods by a Haudenosaunee woman trickster, and she uses the water drum. So it's a lot like the sirens, like ding, 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 and he has to follow that sound, and then he meets up with her, and but that was originally that story was originally in my collaborator I met at Syracuse, his name's Govind DC. He was from India, and on first day of classes, I said, "Hi, I'm Terry. I'm an American Indian." And this other guy across the way kind of gave me a funny look, and he goes, "Hi, I'm Govind. I'm an Indian too, but I'm from India." And then the room, the classroom, just sort of like, wait, we have this colonizer's English word of Indian that can be applied to two different people from two different parts of the world, two different histories and two different cultures. And so we ended up, Govind and I ended up collaborating on a lot of my films that are on my website. There were collaborations that we did together. And but Give and Take was originally an Indian from India tale about a man seeking knowledge. He meets this being who gives him all the knowledge and then kills him before he can leave. We didn't kill off our main character, did it more of an opportunity for the anthropologist to learn something. But a lot of my films as well, they end up being unresolved. So everyone's like, did that anthropologist learn his lesson when I'm like, that's up to the viewer to decide, because maybe he did or maybe he didn't. So.
Yeah, it's funny we speak about it now, because in India, they are now thinking about changing the name of the country, because, of course, this is the English that have chosen to call them Indians, exactly that what they did in America too. And it's and I was thinking, well, if they change their names finally, we will be able to be Indians without guiltiness.
Yeah. Yeah. And Govind and I made my senior thesis film at Syracuse was called Indian. And no, it was called Gathered Places, and Indian documentary film. And there, Govind comes to an Indian comes to the reservation, and I, American Indian or indigenous person, Indian, goes to India. But we're using the colonizers' language. That's the only way that we can communicate with one another. And the idea is like, how do we view each other? How do we view ourselves? And how do we view the world? And a lot of times, what I feel really good about right now, being an indigenous filmmaker, is that we're in control over what the stories that are told. We're in control of how they're told, why they're told. It's not, and it's also not, it's not put through the dominant culture lens. When we were in India, and even here on the reservation, I use the term culture porn, because it's sort of like there's a want and desire to see like the bad stuff, you know, and I wasn't going to put the camera into like the typical things that can be on a reservation, and same things with India. So it's empowering to be able to tell these stories, but also in suit for my brother as well. I have my great grandfather reciting Gonyonyok, which is the Thanksgiving address, but it's not too loud. I give you just enough, but you want to hear it. You want it because his voice is so clear. But that's done on purpose. That's, you know, I say that my films are there to entertain, educate in some ways, in what I feel like I'm not overly, I don't want people in my community saying you're telling things that we already know, but then I don't want non-indigenous people to say I'm completely lost in terms of what you've done. It's like finding that balance between using storytelling as a way to entertain, educate, and hopefully reflect in the end, to say, and again, humanizing the other. It's like, oh, I didn't know Native people lived in houses, or I didn't know that they drove cars like we did. You know, those are some questions that people still wonder, you know, who we are, not only historically, but who we are now. So.
And as the title of your last film, Savage Future, is telling us, is that this narrative sovereignty we are having more and more now lead us also to the identity that we can transmit to those who will follow us. So this is also, there is a line of transmission and a line of creation, and I think they are both closely synchro. They have to, this has to be worked together.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And this is what you do, actually.
Yeah, I mean, as I said, at the time when I made them, there were class assignments, so I was just sort of like, not having a lot of filters in terms of like how I think it's going to be received. It's really how I felt, like organically, how I wanted to tell these stories. So for me going forward, and especially with my thesis film, that's actually going to be my first like original work not made in academia, not made in my undergrad. There were 13 class assignments in my that's on my website that went to film festivals all over the world, but those were class assignments that I did in academia. My thesis film will be one that I made it myself, but it's also through this new vision that I have, that of not, how can I say it? It's like I want to still, I'm doing my best to tap into not being filtered through expectations, my expectations, or I'm trying to stay true to how I tell stories, and and I'm not saying it's the right way. I'm saying something that works for me. Yeah, I'm excited. And then I have 2 other short films. The one I spoke about earlier that was 4.5 pages, it was called Sewn. That I already shot that. It's an 8-minute film narrative based on a true story, based on 2 residential school girls from Canada. And what it has to do is it takes place in the 1950s, and the girls try to run away from residential school. They get caught, they get put in confinement. The younger girl carries around this like security blanket or sheet, and they get separated, and then she has an anxiety attack, and the older girl rips that blanket or that sheet in half and gives her half, and they don't see each other until they're elders. And that happened. And so as elders, they re-meet again, and then they sew that blanket back together again. But that was based on a true story. That happened in Canada. I think in 2001, 2002, there was the Reconciliation Act, and they had set like these millions of dollars to help Indigenous communities heal. But it wasn't like a clinical thing, like you have to see a psychiatrist or you have to take these pharmaceutical drugs in order to feel better. No, this was like organic healing. So there was a story about one elder. She says, I want to meet my friend, revisit my friend that I knew in residential school to sew our blanket back together. And they gave her the funds. That's all the proposal was that they needed. So I shot that. I just have to reshoot the flashbacks. It's told in present day. They start with them as elders. We flash back to them running away and getting caught, and then we come back to present day. And then another one is called From Beyond. I'm gonna start pre-production for that. And that actually that's kind of based on Soup for My Brother. My script writing professor at York said as an exercise, why don't you take your characters that you have in your thesis film, and why don't you flip it, put them in a different realm. So I'm like, okay, so maybe I'll make it grandmother and granddaughter. And instead of the grandmother being the knowledge keeper, maybe the grandmother went to residential school and doesn't have as much knowledge as she probably wants. And then, so I made the granddaughter the one who's learning and kind of teaching the grandmother. But she asked her about her experience there, but the memories are too painful for her to even share. So it isn't until the grandmother passes away that the granddaughter discovers this room full of all the grandmother's memories that was too painful for her to share when she was alive. But she saved everything and she marked everything. You know, this was the turtle rattle of my grandfather, you know, made, and blah, blah, blah. And she has a journal. These are all these journals that the grandmother wrote. So that's my next 3 narrative projects. I'm sure there's going to be there is an experimental one that's going to be in there as well that has to deal with the Charleston dance being borrowed from the Seneca fish dance, and it's already made. I just gotta find 1920s flapper girl videos and then also the music, but right now, I'm at this point in my life, I'm having fun. It's hard work sometimes, and it's stressful being a filmmaker, especially with my thesis film. I'm like, because I did very small set. It's just me and the cinematographer and the actors, my brother or my nephew and my father. But I found a location. It was on a farm. Good things. I always run into luck. I found this. I asked a friend if they knew anybody who had a farm, because there's no more farms really on our reservation, so our territory. But there was one about 6 miles from here. And she goes, oh, somebody contacted me and says, oh, it was a friend of a friend. She goes, I have a farm. I just bought my grandparents' farm. So if you want to come and look at it. And I looked at it, I'm like, this is perfect. And she was more or less like, whenever you want to come here, it's open. Here's the keys to my farm. So I didn't have to worry about having shooting days at a specific place and a specific time. And so I did the location scouting, I did the costume design, I did the props, and then same with acting, doing sketches with my dad and my nephew. But hopefully that intimacy will, and that's what was with Soup for My Brother, my dog. It was just me and my dad in the back of my uncle's house. There was no sound person. When it screamed that imaginative, somebody's came up and they said, "Can I give your dad a hug?" And I'm like, well, you have to ask my mom. But it was in the international short section, and it was interesting to see all the credits in the other films had sound design and special effects and color correction, and then mine was a film by Terry Jones, and I did the best that I could do with what I had. But people said it didn't need all those bells and whistles. It didn't need gloss. It didn't need shine. It actually was the story is good, and you have good sound. People will forgive sometimes the unpolished sometimes feel of my films.
Yeah, it could be a mark of authenticity too. This it's not transformed. It is the reality that goes through the art. We can touch it almost. Mm-hmm. So Terry, thank you to have opened your kitchen to our curiosity, your filmmaker kitchen, and we really look forward, and we cannot wait to look at it, to the productions you have going on now. That looks all very, very good, and well, for obviously for a director of festival, this is encouraging, because it means that we will have very, very good films to show in our next events in Montreal. Yeah. So thank you very much for the time you passed with that. We recommend people to go to tormjerseymedia.com for have a look, and then go. You will have the first films, a lot to see, and the link to Canadian Filmmakers Distribution Center too. So you can. This is possible to have the link to discover all your works and keep in touch with you and the films that you are doing right now and that will be released in the next years. So thanks again. And
thank you, André, and thank you, First Peoples Festival. It means a lot to. I like to think I'm an emerging filmmaker, but people are like, "Well, you're not emerging anymore. You're kind of already arrived." So, but it still means a lot when festivals like First Peoples shows our work, especially to bilingual audience that allows, as I said, it all comes down to the human experience that we all share, and hopefully. But I appreciate it. So thank you, and I look forward to seeing you at the next event program.